we tried to demonstrate how different forms of political conflict are driven by similar mechanisms and processes. We studied not just social movements, but more violent forms of contention like civil wars and revolutions. And we studied more conventional forms like Spanish democratization and educational reform movements. We tried to use our approach to study all forms of contention and not only social movements. Why should I begin my talk with these points? Well, in the 1990s, it seemed to many of my colleagues and to myself that a movement society was developing in the global north. The debate over the movement society continues today. But what's the meaning of this term, movement society? There are three possible meanings, and they are the meanings I'm going to talk about today. The first meaning is global movements. The idea that globalization and its discontents have created a wave of resistance across the planet, or at least in different regions of the global north or the global south. The second meaning is the term contained or conventional movements. And the idea here is that unconventional collective action, protest, is becoming so widespread and so common, and the response of authorities so institutionalized that movements are becoming part of conventional politics. But there's a third meaning to the term global, to the term movement society. As we saw in the violence in the streets of Athens, and as we see in the appearance of violent demonstrations at international summits and in Islamic terrorism, today's global society is increasingly turbulent. In order to assess what's changed in the world of contentious politics and what remains constant, I'm going to try and examine these three meanings: global movements, contained movements, and warring movements. And I'll close with a new issue, an issue that I think has been given insufficient attention by social movement scholars. I will close with some reflections on the interactions between contentious politics and repression. In the past decade, there's been an extraordinary emphasis on what some have called global social movements in the United States, in Western Europe, and in Latin America. When I looked for articles about Brazil in English in preparing for this talk, I was struck by how many of these articles over the last decade focused on the impact of globalization. Now, the fact that the World Social Forum was first held in Porto Alegre helps to explain this. But a good deal of it also has to do with the idea that globalization has made domestic political conflict appear secondary to global systemic factors, especially to many younger scholars who are excited with the idea of altered globalization. The only domestic movement in Brazil that seems to have attracted great attention from among Anglo-Saxon writers is the MST. In the Google search that I carried out to prepare for this talk, I found 10,700 hits for the Black movement, 53,000 for the women's movement, this is all in Brazil, 124,000 for the Brazilian labor movement, 423,000 for the MST, and over 2 million for globalization plus Brazil. For Anglo-Saxon sources, Brazil and globalization are very closely connected. We know almost nothing else about your vital civil society and your social movement sectors. Now, it's true that under the broad umbrella of globalization, there have been a wave of challenges to states and elites. In their excellent synthesis, Bringel and Munoz divide these challenges into 4 phases. First, from the end of the 1980s, mainly in Europe, a number of counter-summits were organized against the major international financial institutions, beginning with a spectacular protest against the IMF in Berlin in 1988. Second, this trend continued in the 90s, but it spread to the global south, with protests against the MAI in South America and in North America against none. The third phase began spectacularly in Seattle, with a battle against the World Trade Organization, and it spread to protests around the world. And fourth, the war in Iraq and the World Social Forum brought a return to more contained and conventional forms of protest. The United States and other anti-war movements resembled earlier peace movements much more than the more disruptive global justice campaigns. While the World Social Forum was marked, and I quote from my friend again, by, quote, the majoritarian presence of the European and Latin American middle class and the growing presence of parties and political leaders like Chavez or Lula. The Italian scholar Mario Pianta and his collaborators have traced the numerical development of these transnational civil society events. They're reproduced here so that you can see that there's been a major increase in the number of such events, especially during the third and fourth phases that Breno and his collaborator described in their paper. Pianta's findings relate mainly to the forum process and to civil society events as they spread from Western Europe and Latin America to the rest of the world over the last decade. But there are 2 troubling questions that Pianta's data do not answer. First, that states and their police forces have responded vigorously, many would say violently, against these new forms of contention. And I'll turn to this issue of violent state responses to protest in the final part of my talk. But second, the forums and the civil society events that have diffused transnationally in the last decade are not fundamentally contentious in the sense that McAdam, Tilley, and I defined that term. In Dynamics of Contention, we define contentious politics as episodic, public, collective interaction among makers of claims and their objects, when at least one government is a claimant, an object of claims, or a party to the claims, and the claims would, if realized, affect the interests of at least one of the claimants. Using that definition, with Doug Endig, I applied the contentious politics approach empirically to transnational contention in the European Union. We reasoned that Europe is the most integrated region of the world. We reasoned that Europe is taking over more and more of responsibility for public policy in Europe. And if that's the case, it should give rise to transnational political movements over these policies. That was our hypothesis. Well, we turned out to be largely wrong. Although there were a very large number of protests in Europe during the period we studied, the late 1980s and the